Okay. All righty. So we are going to talk a little bit about Unit 5. And just for reminders for everybody, we are speaking about the time period at the closing of the Mexican-American War, so about 1848, all the way until the end of Reconstruction, so 1877. So it's a relatively short unit. It's a little less than 30 years. But a lot happens in that 30 years. So we want to go ahead and try to remind ourselves of all of that stuff. So we began the unit, we were talking about the effects of the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War, if you remember, it's a very short war. It's 2 years, begins in 1846. The causes really are an extension of James K. Polk's and the country's desire for manifest destiny. So we annexed Texas, which had been an independent country separate from Mexico since 1836. In 1845, it becomes part of the United States. The U.S. makes overtures to buy more land. Mexico says no. It's a standoff on the Rio Grande River. It turns into fighting, and the U.S. declares war for the second time in history on Mexico. It is a 2-year war. It's a relatively short one. The U.S. goes very far south, so we actually capture Mexico City. But we give up a lot of that land and are really just focused on the area that is sort of part of our section of the North American continent today. And that becomes the Mexican Cession. So in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we write a check to Mexico for $15 million. And we get all of that land. And that's what sets off the events really of this unit. This unit really, when we look at Unit 5, we're looking at the condition of slavery, which has remained for the most part stagnant, unchanged in American history up to this point, and is going to undergo significant change in Unit 5. So although there was talk with the Wilmot Proviso, which was not a law that was passed, but it was an attempt to pass a law before the Mexican-American War, that if we won and won land, slavery would not go west. But it did not go anywhere. So David Wilmot was actually a Northern Democrat. He did not want, he could see in the future that slavery would become too confrontational. He didn't want to see that happen. So his goal was, hey, if we're going to fight this war, let's just agree the slavery doesn't go west. Obviously, not enough people were willing to vote on that in Congress. And so the war proceeds, we win, we purchase the Mexican Cession. And in doing so, now slavery is going to become an issue deeply embedded in westward expansion. So much so that we have people who believe, oh, it's going to be 30, 40 years before people really come out west to what we would call Arizona, Nevada, California today. In actual fact, it only takes about 1.5 years before we are seeing hundreds of thousands of people move west. And primarily, most of those people early on are moving into California, and especially Northern California, where they discover gold in 1849. So the California gold rush is going to bring in, literally in less than a year, 100,000 people. Those 100,000 people, for the most part, are minors. They are people who don't own slaves. They are people who want to maybe see if they can find their hand at making money, finding gold in the West. A lot of people go out there, they don't find gold, but they do want to establish a state. So there are so many people who've gotten out there and understand to go to California in 1849 meant that you probably either got on a train and got to what we called Independence, Missouri. You crossed the Mississippi by river, crossed that, and then you on foot or horseback walked across the country on maybe something like the Oregon Trail or what was called the Santa Fe Trail, some of these trails that move west, or you got on a ship, maybe in Boston or New York, and you sailed all the way around the tip of Argentina and then back up north to what is San Francisco today, which could be as long as a 6-month journey. So people who got out there weren't going back east. They committed themselves. And so statehood. And with statehood, this presents a whole host of problems. So if you remember in 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise, and that only has to do with the land that's basically in the central part of the United States, what was the Louisiana Purchase. And they made that decision to draw that 3630 line. Anything above it, except for Missouri, will be a free state in the future. Anything south of 3630 will be a slave state. But we've added to the country now. And if we attempted to continue that line, well, it would literally bisect California. And again, the people who went to California didn't bring slaves with them. So they create a state constitution that has no slavery. And Congress now has to decide what is the future. People who are slave owners, people who are pro-slavery, want to see slavery spread west. They are unhappy about this, because if California in its entirety comes in as a free state, what does it mean for all these other pieces of land in the Mexican cession? For abolitionists, they're absolutely determined that California come in as a free state, and they want to see everything in the future that is in this West become free states. So it's a standoff. Who's going to win? And this is really the last time we're going to see Henry Clay function as a compromiser. So he, Daniel Webster, and a new senator from Illinois, a man named Stephen Douglas, they are going to broker this agreement. And their goal is, what are some things that are going to help Northerners and Whigs be happy with the condition of slavery and its existence in the country, especially as we go west? What do we do for pro-slavery advocates? And so we get 5 laws. Okay, and we need to know those 5 pieces. We call them the Missouri Compromise, but like we call them the Compromise of 1850, but like the Missouri Compromise, we're speaking about laws. Okay, so these 5 laws. The first one is California comes into the Union as a free state, but that is going to satisfy only half of that group. So the other half of the group, how do we satisfy them? Well, for anyone who has owned a slave, who that slave has escaped, has run off to try to find freedom in the North, those people want a very strong, stringent Fugitive Slave Act, and that's what they get. And the Fugitive Slave Act, there is one as a part of the Constitution. There was one that was passed in 1793, but basically it just says that an enslaved person is not a person, they're property, and they are to be returned. This one is even more stringent. It actually could criminally punish anyone who harbored escaped slaves or did anything to help someone escape from slavery. So in a sense, it made overnight almost any person in the North who had any connection with a runaway slave guilty of a crime. And so it was incredibly unpopular to people in the North. Some states will go on and pass what they call personal liberty laws. So sort of a kind of irony that you'll see northern states start talking about states' rights. New York has the right to ensure the liberty of its citizens and those who've come to live in their state. So you are going to see some states attempt to put up some kind of barrier to this new Fugitive Slave Act. But a lot of people found themselves overnight having lived for decades as free people in the North and being returned southward pretty rapidly. The other 2 things that are going to be important and related to this. So the slave trade had existed all over the southern part of the United States, but some of the largest slave markets are going to be on the East Coast. Charleston will be one of them. The other one is a little farther north, and it'll be Washington, D.C. And we don't think of the nation's capital as a place where that would go on, but it was one of the largest slave markets in the United States. And it was something that visitors, even people like Alexis de Tocqueville, came to visit the United States and said, what is going on? You talk about liberty and democracy, and you buy and sell human beings literally down the street from your Capitol building. Like that, something's not right here. So there were people, even pro-slavery people, who were like, maybe if we're going to keep slavery, we're going to keep slavery quietly. We need to not have it in the Capitol. So although it does not abolish slavery, it abolished the slave trade from Washington, D.C. And it's a small victory, but for abolitionists, that was quite satisfying. We're also going to see that people start talking about the idea of popular sovereignty. So prior to 1848, popular sovereignty meant the people's right to rule. Fundamentally, it's a principle of Enlightenment thinking when it comes to democracy. You elect representatives. That's popular sovereignty. The phrase is going to take on all new meaning with the Compromise of 1850. And it's going to be now that popular sovereignty is the will of people in a territory to decide whether or not there'll be slavery. So this won't be something that Congress decides. It'll be something that the people who live there decide. At what point did they decide this? Well, in theory, when there's enough of them to write a state constitution and apply for statehood. But obviously, we know people move out west, and they move out there as slave owners or not slave owners. So Utah and New Mexico will be two places where we see that there is now in the future going to be popular sovereignty. If you look at New Mexico territory and Utah territory, they are very expansive places on this map. They become several different states in the future. But Utah had very few people living there. Some small Native American tribes, especially along what's called the Great Basin, and then the Mormons who'd moved out there in the 1840s. You also see that the New Mexico territory at this point is a few people from Texas, especially in the east part of New Mexico. But again, most of the people who live in this area are actually smaller tribal groups who are related to the Anasazi. So you don't actually have a large white presence, and people did not expect that there would be one quite soon. And so this was sort of putting off the slavery debate to a later time. It also is going to establish with a fifth law what will be the boundary today between New Mexico and Texas. Texas was so much bigger. Even though it's large today, it was a much bigger area when it became a state in 1845. So those five things, again, Congress feels we're going to make this compromise. Each side's going to get something they want. They're going to live with the consequences of what they don't want. And much like the Missouri Compromise, it's going to last 3 decades. Unfortunately, this compromise basically lasts maybe 4 years if we're talking about what will be the Kansas Nebraska Act in 1854. Maybe you could say that part of its longevity goes all the way to the Civil War, but it's not going to be as long lasting. Why? Because we're seeing this debate over slavery intensify. Why is it intensifying? Because we have had sudden advancement westward, far greater and quicker than anyone could predict. We're also going to see that Manifest Destiny itself isn't just about adding land to the United States, but it's also about how are we going to move people and goods. This market revolution that began in the 1790s in the Northeast, well, as people have moved west, at least in the North, right, they built canals, they built roads, they built railroads. That market revolution has continued further west. And now that we have all this land all the way to the Pacific, especially people who own large companies, corporations, they want to interconnect markets. And so between 1851 and 1854, there are going to be many people in Congress who ultimately are representing the ideas of these business owners who say, you know what, we've got the land now we have to grow our market share, if you will. So the first thing is, well, if we're going to build a transcontinental railroad, where are we going to build it? For people who lived in the North, they like the idea of just continuing it as a northern line. Someone like Stephen Douglas, who was from Illinois and from a small town called Chicago in 1851, he really wanted to have that railroad go through his town so it would become a big city one day. And that would be a northern line of the transcontinental railroad. If you were in the South, they wanted to make sure that cotton was going to be carried across the country, and they wanted to see a southward line where its sort of central hub would be New Orleans, which also was a major city because it's on the Mississippi River. So in order to build north, there's going to be some changes that have to happen. In order to build south, some changes have to happen. So what we call the Gadsden Purchase, it is what you see in yellow here. James Gadsden was the Secretary of State and helped broker this. So he went back to Mexico and said, yeah, I know we just bought a bunch of land from you and we fought a war, but all of this land, especially if you've ever been out to Phoenix, it's very uneven. There's a lot of mountains, there's valleys. They needed very flat land if they were going to build a railroad. So what is the sort of the Tucson area today? They bought all of this land for yet more money, another 10 million, in order to potentially have the southward line. It's important to note that this southward line will eventually be built, but it will not be built until really the 1880s. It's going to take a very long time. The Northern line will prevail in part because of Stephen Douglas and the fact that there was already so much northeastern industry that's going to be behind building a Northern line. The only problem is to build a Northern line, all of the area outside of the Louisiana Purchase, all the way to what is basically Oregon and Washington State today, was known as permanent Indian territory. It will not be permanent Indian territory after 1854, but it was land that had been sort of set aside in the Jacksonian era, thinking that it would one day become where Native people lived. A lot of Sioux Indians lived in that area. The United States government decides, you know what, we are going to turn that land potentially into a place that we can see white people living, and we're going to build our railroad there. But again, the question is slavery going to go west? Some of this land is actually a little bit outside of the Louisiana Purchase. Most of it is within the Louisiana Purchase. And those who owned slaves didn't want to see a railroad and all this building happening in an area where pro-slavery people couldn't take advantage of it. So again, we're going to see another set of compromises, another deal, and we're going to have what's called the Kansas Nebraska Act. So this land that is, for the most part of the Louisiana Territory is going to get divided up. The southern part is called Kansas Territory. The northern part is called Nebraska Territory. And it's going to be decided slavery can go there or not based on popular sovereignty. So that idea that we used for Utah and New Mexico Territory in 1850 is going to be used here. And we know that's going to become incredibly unpopular with time. But you have Northerners who are willing to do anything to have a railroad, and you have Southerners who feel that if they're going to vote for a railroad to be built in the North, they have to have the potential to be able to utilize it and bring slavery northward as well. The other piece of this is that the United States wasn't looking just simply to connect New York to California. In 1853, the United States is going to send its Navy to Japan. They're going to go to the harbor of Takugawa, and there they're going to bring in their warships and say that they are there on a peaceful journey to broker a trade agreement. So China was already an area that was being divided up by lots of European nations. There were sections of China only that traded with Great Britain, and some with France, Germany, Russia. The United States wanted a Far Eastern trading partner. There were lots of good things like porcelain and silks, types of tea that could not be produced in the United States. So these were things that they wanted, and they wanted to be able to sell American products to the Japanese. So the Treaty of Takugawa is going to now create essentially a market that begins in New York City and ends in Japan. By the technology of the time, you could sail from Japan to California in about 3 to 6 weeks. Then you would, in theory, have this railroad that in 5 days could take those goods clear across the United States. And you now have taken what was once 6 months or a year of travel. And we use the word supply chain today, right? Connecting markets and getting goods from factories into the hands of consumers, still an interest that we have. But it's going to be a game changer. Japan will become a very wealthy and successful and westernized nation because of it. And the United States will also benefit from it economically. But all of this is really about manifest destiny. It is God proclaimed that we go west, and we're going to see that that Western market and that Western trade is going to even actually extend even beyond the shores of the United States across the Pacific as well. And we'll talk more about this when we get to Unit 7. We're going to talk about imperialism and global trade in the late 19th century. So we'll pick up this thread at a different time. So going back to Kansas, we know that Kansas becomes a place of great torment because once it's said popular sovereignty will decide, the people who settle in Kansas, if they want slavery, they get slavery. If they want abolition, they get abolition. Well, we've got two sides competing and desperate to fill up Kansas as quickly as possible. They need 60,000 people. to become a state. And so whether that's going to be 60,000 people, the majority of whom are abolitionists, or 60,000 people, the majority of whom are pro-slavery, that was to be seen. But in 1854, immediately following the passage of the Kansas Nebraska Act, we are going to see thousands upon thousands of people. They won't get to quite 60,000 people in 2 years, but they'll get pretty close to it. And this Kansas Nebraska Act does some other things. It nullifies the Missouri Compromise. It's gone. It does not matter anymore. That 3630 line that had survived for 34 years no longer exists. Popular sovereignty is the name of the game. And we are going to see violence come out of it. We're going to see people try to do all kinds of things to purport that their side is victorious. So in 1856, in the town of Lecompton, which was a pro-slavery town, they said that they had done their own census, that they had at least 60,000 people living in Kansas territory. They wrote themselves a constitution and sent it to Congress, and Congress wouldn't even entertain it. They were like, by our records and the way we count, you don't have 60,000 people. But James Buchanan, who was the president at the time, he actually gave it an audience, read it, and said, well, it seems pretty legitimate to me. And although it never becomes the Constitution of Kansas, Kansas won't become a state until the Civil War, it was enough to encourage even more fighting and bloodshed. We know that we're going to have incidents of violence for 2 years, which ultimately culminates in violence in the Capitol building. So that tale that I always tell of Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks, but ultimately you have people in Congress who are going to beat each other up, and one person is almost going to be killed because of it. But Bleeding Kansas is a really good way of being able to see that slavery and the debate over slavery essentially has devolved into violence. By 1856, there doesn't actually seem to be any kind of way in which, at least through politics, the power of Congress, you are going to see any kind of resolution. It's important to note that the majority of people in Congress, especially those who voted for popular sovereignty, they were voting to get out of the responsibility of deciding whether slavery moved west. That's why they did it. It was not, and people like Charles Sumner were always against popular sovereignty. They believed slavery was wrong. We weren't going to put it to a vote. But that Sumner-Brooks affair, it in some ways also is the end to the violence, because after it, Congress does do one thing, which is they just table any further attempts by the territory of Kansas for statehood, and say it's something that they'll come back to. But they are not willing, at least until the next census, to even begin to talk about this idea of statehood. So in a sense, something good did come out of it. Let's see if we can get another one. There you go. So in the 1850s, we see a lot of political changes. The second party system, which had been Democrats and Whigs since 1828, is essentially going to dissolve. In the election of 1848 for the presidency, the Whig Party is desperate to win, and they decide that they want the person who is their candidate for president to be someone who has been a general, has popular support. And they pick this man, Zachary Taylor, who was considered sort of the hero and leader during the Mexican-American War. Zachary Taylor is from Louisiana, and he owned slaves. He'd never been a politician. He admitted he'd never voted before he was running for president. But nevertheless, the Whig Party and those who were desperate enough, craven enough to try to secure a victory, they nominate him. And anyone who was an abolitionist in the Whig Party at that point says, I don't think I'm a Whig anymore. I don't know what I am, but I'm not part of this party. So the Whig Party splits over people being pro-slavery and people being anti-slavery. We're also going to see a group of people, mostly Northerners who live in Boston and New York City, who are very upset by the fact that the United States doesn't have an immigration policy. They don't have any kind of quotas. They don't really do anything to stop people from coming here. We need workers, right? That market revolution, right? We're industrializing. And there are a lot of Irish and German people who are coming in the 1830s and 40s. Most of those people are Catholic. If they're from Germany, some of them are also Jewish. They are people who have no prohibition about drinking alcohol, which is something that a lot of people, right, are temperate in the United States. They don't drink at all. Catholicism is different than Protestant Christianity. They're both Christianity, but they have very, very different practices. And so what develops is something called the American Party. It's a splinter party. It's a third party. And its only agenda is to have quotas and limitations on immigration. So it's not a party that's expansive. In most cases, it's not directly involved in the slavery debate, although many of the people who are going to be nativists are also going to be people who are abolitionists too. But that idea of nativism, so essentially that Protestantism in the United States is something that needs to be protected, and people who come from outside are not part of that culture. We're going to see after the Kansas Nebraska Act, and certainly in some ways you see it immediately following the Mexican-American War. There are whites who believe that the West should be settled by white wage labor people, and that if you have slavery, that's going to stop white people from being paid a decent wage, certainly in agricultural work. It is anti-slavery, but it is not abolition for moral reasons. So a little bit different, but this Free Soil Party, which is also a third party, this American Party, and then the Whig Party being split up, that's going to create essentially a void. The Democratic Party is going to win a lot of elections between 1852 all the way up basically until the Civil War. It's going to be kind of a shock to them that they lose the election of 1860. What comes out of all this is the Republican Party. So people like Charles Sumner say, look, we're going to take these anti-slavery people who used to be Whigs like myself. We're going to take these know-nothings, this American Party nativist crowd. We're going to take these free soilers. We can get every single one of those people to believe and agree that slavery doesn't go west. And the majority of those people are willing to say, hey, maybe slavery just shouldn't exist in the United States. And in 1856, out of Bleeding Kansas, the Sumner Brooks affair, they're going to create the Republican Party. And although they're not going to win an election in 1856, it only takes them 4 years. So our third party system, which we still have today, which is Republicans and Democrats, it begins in 1856 as a result of this fracturing of the Whig Party in the early 1850s. Probably the next biggest event of the 1850s is the Dred Scott decision. So if we remember, Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived in sort of quasi-freedom for much of his adult life. He worked for a Dr. Emerson, who was a surgeon in the Army. He spent a lot of time in the area that we call Minnesota today, when it was a territory. There were very few white people there, mostly Native people, actually. And Dr. Emerson allowed Dred Scott a lot of free movement. He had his own home. He would often travel far distances without Dr. Emerson. He had traveled all the way back to St. Louis several times, which was Dr. Emerson's original home. He eventually will marry, and he and his wife Harriet will make that journey up and down the Mississippi quite a few times. They will also live without Dr. Emerson observing them for months on end. And so by the time we get to the 1850s, Dred Scott decides, you know what, I probably should do something like suing for my freedom. He had 2 children by that point. He was very concerned that his daughters might be sold into slavery, especially when Dr. Emerson died, because his widow is now looking for money. And she believes that this is her property and she can sell it. So Dred Scott risks it all, and he and his wife attempt to sue for freedom in Missouri. And for every time they do win in court, they then lose in the next court. And eventually it finds its way to the Supreme Court. And in 1857, there were a lot of Americans who said, you know, popular sovereignty doesn't work. Congress doesn't want to make a decision about slavery in the United States, but I think the Supreme Court, that could be the place where they decide. They look at the Constitution, they look at the realities of life in America circa 1856, 1857. They're going to decide one way or another. And a lot of abolitionists, and I'm not sure why they thought The Supreme Court would be on their side, especially someone like Roger Taney, who I'm pointing at here in my lower corner. He was a slave owner. The vote was split 7-2. The 7 people who voted either owned slaves or had lived in families with slaves as their workers. The 2 people who voted against this idea of the majority and were in favor of Dred getting his freedom, they were people who were abolitionists. So it was very much split amongst political ideology. But Dred Scott's decision is one that is going to ultimately, for a lot of people, signal that there's no real solution, maybe outside of violence or splitting the country in 2. Because the Supreme Court, if you remember, makes some very damning decisions. They take the case so that they can say that no African American has the right to sue in court, because no African American, even if they're free, could ever be a citizen. For the fact that slavery is mentioned in the Constitution, they say the founders intended it to be a society where you had people who had no freedom and weren't citizens. They also said Congress should never have done anything to prohibit slavery. So the Northwest Ordinance of 1789, the Missouri Compromise, all of those things, they said, they're unconstitutional. And that creates a lot of problems, because we're going to actually have states that were created in areas where Congress said you can't bring slavery, right? The state of Ohio was part of that Northwest Ordinance. States like Iowa, right, which were part of that Louisiana territory that will become states by the 1820s and 1830s, slavery was never allowed there. So what does this mean? That slavery now could go to those places? Like, how is this going to be solved? The Taney Court offers no answers to that. But what it sets in motion is the opportunity for someone to take a role of leadership and debate about this subject. And that's going to be Abraham Lincoln, who was not the most successful attorney. He served 1 term in the House of Representatives. But in 1858, he decides he is from Illinois, just like Stephen Douglas, and he is going to run against Stephen Douglas. He's going to try to beat him and win his Senate seat. He does not. He is very easily outvoted. But what he does do is he decides that he's going to take the public and essentially talk to them directly. He does it through the form of debate. So he asked Stephen Douglas for a series of debates, which now historians call the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But people went to see those. And it was really the first time that you had kind of major candidates for any office in the United States go head to head and actually discuss and debate the issues of the day. We see that all the time now, right? It's an expectation when we're trying to figure out who we're going to nominate for president, who is going to be the president of the United States, right? We see lots of debates, but political debate like that really began with Lincoln and Douglas. But Lincoln forces Douglas often to have to explain himself. Why did you ever come up with this idea of popular sovereignty? Now the Supreme Court says that with the Dred Scott decision, the Missouri Compromise should never have happened. Well, what do we tell people in Ohio? Do we tell them they're going to have to vote again and decide by popular sovereignty not to have slavery? And Douglas takes the bait and says, oh yeah, right? Because he's thinking, hey, if people live in Ohio, they don't have slavery, there's free Black people, they'll just vote not to have slavery. And Lincoln says, well, that's great. So what about like a state like Alabama? Could they put it to a vote and decide? And if they decided that there were enough people who said slavery should be abolished, that overnight anyone who owned a slave would have to give up that property. And Douglas is in trouble at this point because he's saying, yeah, actually, that is what I'm saying. I'm saying everywhere it could be up for vote. Popular sovereignty could happen at any time in any place. It's called the Freeport Doctrine because this discussion happened in Freeport, Illinois. But ultimately, it is going to ruin the political chances of Stephen Douglas ever being president of the United States. Every pro-slavery Democrat in the South says, man ever runs for president, I'm not going to vote for him. So in 1860, we are going to see an attempt at an election. And that attempt is going to be between 4 candidates. So not only are we going to see Lincoln himself running, but we're also going to see that Douglas wants in on it. We're going to see 2 other candidates also come into being. And I know we looked at this picture in class, but I think it's an important one to go back and look at, especially because these 4 candidates are literally ripping apart the fabric of the country. This is a map. Maps at one time typically were on canvas if they were to be held or projected in a classroom or something. So, right, that's fabric, it's cloth. They're literally ripping it apart. Lincoln is the advocate of no slavery in the West at this point, and so that's why he's holding the western part of our map. We see that the central part, which has got Illinois, Indiana, it's the northern central part. That's what Douglas is holding on to. We see the South is literally being torn apart and carried off by this man. His name was John Breckinridge, and he is going to represent the Southern pro-slavery faction of the Democratic Party. And then our little friend over here who's got his little pot of glue, and he's trying to kind of glue states together and put the map back together. His name is John Bell, and he created a third party called the Union Party. And his hope was that he was going to be the peace candidate. He was going to say, hey, you know what? I'm just going to keep the country together. We don't have to divide over this issue. I think we can work together. Obviously, we know Lincoln wins. And Lincoln's win is significant for the fact you can see all this red are the states he wins. They are states with large populations. They're predominantly in the North, although he wins these 2 West Coast states as well. He unfortunately was not on the ballot in the majority of these Southern states. So the 11 states that will eventually become the Confederacy, he doesn't appear on their ballot. And so the idea that he could win and become the president of the United States when half the country didn't even have the opportunity to vote for him was really problematic. So when the Electoral College meets in 1860, they say Lincoln has plenty of votes. You can see here, he's going to be our winner. But in doing that, what he's ultimately doing is creating this huge problem because there are people who say, wait a minute, not my president, right? And I know I often use some of the phrases of our day in the way that they would also be used in an earlier time. But there were a lot of people who were truly concerned about that election and its outcome. Some, like South Carolina, are going to secede before Lincoln is even inaugurated. We're going to see other states that will soon follow suit. And by the time we get to April of 1861, Lincoln is inaugurated. He's been in office for a month, and he has said those states need to come back into the Union. They never left. They are states in rebellion. And the South is going to take it even further by firing on this space, which is Fort Sumter in the harbor at Charleston. And war begins. It is a 4-year war. Again, it is a war, but it is not a war. Congress never declares war. The Confederacy is never recognized as its own independent country by any other nation or the United States. But we are going to see about 600,000 lives consumed throughout this conflict. So I want to just talk about the Civil War in terms of turning points, okay? Because I think that's what's the most significant in terms of any kind of testing that we do, which is in 1861, Charleston Harbor is attacked. It's a fort there. The Union Army won't leave it. Because of the attack, they do have to surrender the fort. And Lincoln calls for 100,000 volunteers. And at that time, all those volunteers were white. But we will see that by 1863, Lincoln will allow African Americans also to become soldiers, which will be significant. They're going to be about 200,000 in number by the end of the war. And one of the reasons, not all, but one of the reasons that the Union prevails. Probably the biggest turning points, there's really 3 of them. So the first one is in 1863, what is called the Conscription Act. The Union Army had volunteers for 2 years. And over time, less and less people wanted to volunteer because it didn't seem like the Union was going to win. They had all these great plans like the Anaconda Plan that didn't work. They had general after general who would find himself being fired because he couldn't win on the battlefield. And so in 1863, Lincoln begins a draft. And that draft is going to prove to be incredibly unpopular for one very good reason. You could buy your way out of the draft. So if you were a wealthy person, you paid $300, or you simply found someone and paid them to volunteer on your behalf. Most of the people who would take $300 to risk their life in those days were pretty desperate, poor people. So if I was a working class Irish immigrant in New York, I would be lucky if I could make $100 a year. So if someone offered me $300, I might die, but that's 3 years of money for my family. I might be willing to take it. I might be that desperate. So the Conscription Act is actually going to lead to draft riots. In New York City, you're going to see Irish immigrants who don't want to be drafted, don't like this idea that people can buy themselves out of service, and they're actually going to riot and unfortunately take their anger out on the free Black population of New York City. But there were a lot of immigrants who will get either conscripted, so they're drafted themselves, or they will serve as a substitute, again, because of money. Also, if you served in the Union Army and you were an immigrant, they would make you a citizen. So it was another way of sort of luring people in, but it was very unpopular. And by the beginning of the 20th century, the idea that you could have a substitute, that there were people who could get out of the draft that easily, will go away. The modern draft is a little bit different than that. Another turning point is going to be the Battle of Gettysburg. That is one of two incursions that the Southern Army, the Confederate Army, makes. They are going to move north and go to essentially the farms of southern Pennsylvania. And on the July 4th weekend of 1863, you're going to see the essentially largest battle of the Civil War. More than 40,000 people are going to die over the course of 3 days. And it is going to be a decisive victory for the North. The South at that point is truly fighting a war of attrition. They had been successful early on. They had better trained soldiers, better leadership. Sometimes the element of surprise. They typically were defending their own land, which they knew the topography well. But 1863 is going to devastate much of the cavalry of the Confederate Army. And we are going to begin to see that after July of 1863, that things seem to be on the side of the Union. It also helps that in that year, we're also going to have the Emancipation Proclamation. And I didn't write that here as a turning point, but I would argue it is one as well, simply because Lincoln is going to acknowledge that in the Confederacy, at least, slavery is not going to exist anymore. And even if he can't enforce it, there are plenty of enslaved people that once they hear that, they run off to serve with the Union Army. And there's certainly both formerly enslaved and free Black men who are going to go and serve. This is a picture of the 54th Massachusetts, which was one of the first battalions of African-American soldiers. We're also going to see that another big turning point is going to be Sherman's march to the sea. So in that, we don't have a picture here except our map, but General Sherman and General Grant are basically going to divide themselves up. General Sherman says, I'm going to take the war to the Southern people. He's going to march his troops across, and you can see our blue lines here, across Georgia. They are going to burn and destroy the rail lines going to and out of Atlanta, which was the major rail hub of the Confederacy, and then march about 60,000 men, Union soldiers, all the way to Savannah. And basically a 10-mile swath on either side. They're going to burn every crop. They're going to destroy livestock, barns, people's homes, but they are basically going to starve the Southern people and break their will. Captures Savannah, and then his army will proceed to continue to march north. They will continue to burn everything in their wake until they just get outside of Raleigh, North Carolina in April of 1865. So it is devastating. And it's another thing that's going to significantly contribute to the fact that by April of 1865, the Confederacy has no will to continue. So just to kind of take a step to the side and look at Lincoln himself, we see Lincoln today as a hero, certainly since the 1960s. When you ask people kind of to vote who were the top 5 presidents of all time, Lincoln usually ends up on that list. He was at the bottom of that list for a very long time, and even during his own presidency. So in 1864, he's going to seek re-election, and he is going to win. And you can see our blue here is his opponent, George McClellan, who had been one of his generals early on in the war, who he fired. Lincoln is going to be successful, but he is also going to have to do a lot of pivoting. He has to talk about in 1864, why is the Union still fighting this war 3 years on? And what is his vision for actually closing out this war? And he begins to rely on people like General Grant and General Sherman and their tactics. He's going to speak about the fact that we now have moved from a war that's simply going to stop insurrection and bring the nation back together into a war of freedom. And certainly he's going to get a lot of abolitionist support for that sentiment. But 1864, early on, there were people who thought George McClellan would bring peace. And it was only when Republicans began to say, peace at what price? We've had the Emancipation Proclamation. There are millions of people who now see themselves free. If George McClellan wins, he says he's going to sue for peace. He's going to allow the Confederacy to go off and be its own country. We're going to literally be sacrificing millions of people who, if they're still in the South, they are going to be enslaved forever. So essentially, the morality of why people were fighting the Civil War becomes one of ending slavery. And that's popular enough to get Lincoln the victory. So in April of 1865, total war has worked. Basically for 18 months, Grant's army and Sherman's army have laid siege to cities. They've burned much of the eastern portions of the Confederacy, and they are able to bring the South to its knees, but not its government. So Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy, he doesn't seek to end the war. It'll be Robert E. Lee. And this is a very famous painting of these two men. But Lee was considered always the better soldier. He had a much better pedigree. He was actually in charge of the Union Army before the Civil War. But he is going to seek peace because his men are starving, and he doesn't believe the Southern population can keep going. With that, Lincoln goes to the public and says the war is over. So at Appomattox Courthouse, yes, we see people getting to leave, go home. There's no fighting anymore, but the actual Confederate government is on the run and isn't really acknowledging this freedom. And ultimately, that's why Lincoln is assassinated 6 days later. The conspirator, so you see John Wilkes Booth there, he worked with a whole group of people in Washington, D.C., who were Democrats. They were pro-slavery sympathizers. They decide that the war isn't really over for them. Soldiers may have put down their weapons, but that the government of the United States needs to be turned into chaos. And they believe if they kill the president, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, if they kill General Grant and General Sherman, that all of a sudden who's left will sue for peace. I don't think that was a realistic idea, but that was their conspiracy. They were effective in nearly killing the Secretary of State, William Seward, and obviously they did kill the President of the United States. But his assassination is also going to be a turning point because Lincoln had this vision. He talked about this idea of malice towards none and charity for all. And that was one in which the South wasn't going to have to do a lot to be brought back in the Union. And Lincoln never actually has to kind of live with and solve what problems remain coming out of the Civil War. And it's part of the reason why we see Andrew Johnson and the Republican-controlled Congress be so antagonistic to each other following the war, because they each have very different visions about the country. Lincoln is talking about ultimately just bringing the country back together. Andrew Johnson believes that there are some things that have to change, and he agrees that there should be no more slavery, but he's not really about changing the power structure and the social hierarchy that existed before the war, at least not when it comes to issues that are black and white. We're going to see that the radical Republicans, those people want to start looking at how do we reconstruct the Union. The Union can't simply come back together like it's 1861 and the war never happened, but we actually have to look at American life and we have to reconstruct what that is. And that may be changing our Constitution. It might be reconstructing and rebuilding society in ways that have never existed before. So when we talk about Reconstruction, in terms of a time period, it is April of 1865, really until March of 1877. But Reconstruction really has two phases. So the first phase is what we call presidential Reconstruction. That's when the 13th Amendment is ratified, slavery is abolished across the country. But Andrew Johnson's going to try to do some other things. He wants Confederate leaders to be punished and lose their rights to represent or lead in government again. But he doesn't want to see black and white equality. That was never an interest of his. He was a white supremacist. We're going to see that for individuals like the radical Republicans, and Charles Sumner is a great example of that. He's looking to literally say, okay, not only are enslaved people now free people, but free people have rights. Free people are citizens. We have to have an amendment to the Constitution that ensures that. We have to have suffrage rights. We literally need to change how society is. So the emancipation here, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment that are being referenced here, that's simply this idea that there is no people as property. Radical Reconstruction, which will begin with Congress taking over the whole process of Reconstruction in 1867, is going to be something very different. So the 14th Amendment, again, this is important if we got to know anything for APUSH, the 14th Amendment has to happen because of the Dred Scott decision. Again, Dred Scott, when his case is decided, the Taney court says there are free people and there are enslaved people of color, but none of those people are ever citizens of the United States. So it was vital that we now have an amendment that says anyone born in the United States is a citizen. And that's why that is the first sentence of that amendment. And then they go on to say, if we're going to truly have equality and we're a democracy, then it has to be a participatory one. You have to be able to vote. And this is a famous picture, the first vote here, but you can see this is another Thomas Nast. But that all of these men, they are all men of color who are voting. One of them, let's go back one, sorry. This gentleman's a farmer. His clothes are patched, but they're clean, and with pride, he's voting. We have this gentleman's a little more successful. Maybe he's got some education. This gentleman behind him has served in the Union Army. So for the radical Republicans, they really wanted to create a society that looked a lot more like our society than certainly the one that had existed before the Civil War. President Johnson vetoed everything that the Republicans were attempting to do. The Republicans had a supermajority. They had more than 2/3 of the seats in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they overrode veto after veto after veto. And that's why we'll have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, 1875. We'll have the Reconstruction Act, so the actual military occupation of the South between 1867 and 1877. They'll go so far as to attempt to impeach the president because they believe that what he is doing deliberately is working against the interests of the United States. He's impeached, but he's not removed from office. But it's also why Johnson only serves one term. So Reconstruction, Where it ends is ultimately for a bunch of reasons. Economically, it was expensive. Things like the Freedmen's Bureau cost money. The military occupation of the South was an expensive prospect to have hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would occupy outside of polling places, that would protect at Freedmen's Bureau events and offices. Those things cost a lot of money. And in 1873, about midway through the Reconstruction period, we have a massive economic crisis. We're also going to see that by 1868, 1869, individuals who had been in leadership prior to the Civil War, especially those who had gotten pardons early on from President Johnson when he did that, those redeemers are going to be in local government, state governments. They still can't necessarily run for Congress, but at the state level, those redeemers are going to be writing black codes. They are going to be putting into effect grandfather clauses and poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent African-American suffrage. So there are lots of things working against the interests of Reconstruction, including organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. There is a lot of, especially in the South, white sentiment that is supremacist and is working to resist these changes. So in the election of 1876, General Grant, as president, had a lot of scandals. The Republican Party is kind of in a difficult place. They've had 12 years, right? Lincoln ran the country, and then Johnson, and then we have time with President Grant. And yes, there have been some very significant changes, but America basically for more than a decade has known nothing but war and conflict. The economy's not in a good place. And we have lots of redeemers who not only now are back running state governments, but some of them are actually sitting in Congress as well. And so the election of 1876 is basically a statistical tie. There's no significant electoral win for either candidate Rutherford B. Hayes or candidate Samuel Tilden. And so their election will go into the House of Representatives, and there will be an agreement brokered. There are 3 states that their vote counts, their tallies were not consistent, and they each declared that both Hayes and Tilden had won their state. That's true for South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And the question was, well, who did actually win? There was a lot of things that went on in the voting for those elections that people had their doubts about the accuracy and the validity of the election. So President Grant asked Hayes and Tilden and Congress to basically talk it out and try to come up with some solution. And the solution was that the Republican Party was desperate to keep the presidency because the executive branch came with the spoil system, patronage, thousands and thousands, actually 120,000 jobs nearly. The Democratic Party, what they wanted was, especially in the South, was the ability to run their own states and to be influential in Congress again. And so Samuel Tilden didn't get to be president, but he became essentially a hero of the Democratic Party because he made it possible for Reconstruction to end. So President Hayes wins, but the price of that win for the Republican Party is they agree to end Reconstruction. And a month after inauguration in April of 1877, Reconstruction officially ends. The troops are removed. The Reconstruction Acts, the enforcement acts, all of those things go away. And the South is basically left to their own devices. And much of the system of suppression and segregation that had existed prior to the Civil War comes back again and is maintained. There are some people who are going to be able to overcome those challenges, but it's going to be because they leave. So my picture here, this is a group of people who were all exodusters. So these the gentlemen and ladies, they actually came from Mississippi. They moved to Oklahoma in 1877 and started lives over again as farmers with grants from the Homestead Act. But Reconstruction, it's important to know that there's significant change constitutionally, but socially and electorally, there was pretty significant change, but again, only for a window of about 10 years. By 1877, Reconstruction ends, and we see a social order that in many respects is not that much different than what existed prior to the Civil War. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I imagine that if I'm looking at what I have in terms of all of my stuff in my chat, I want to make sure that if you have some questions that we answer those before we go. We are stopping at the end of Reconstruction. So the topic of the New South is actually kind of where we begin Unit 6. And we will talk about that after our test, but it's not something that's part of our test. So some of you may have seen a video the other day that includes some of those topics, but I just wanted to make sure that we got all of sort of the big vocab out of the way. And if there are words or phrases that I have forgotten but are on your list, I am happy to answer those. Just a reminder, our test is 25 multiple choice questions. That's all it is, because we're going to turn around about a week and a half from now and take a midterm. And so we want to have real quick feedback about our knowledge of Unit 5. And then we will come back and begin to prepare for our midterm. And we will make sure that we're getting not only some review with our other units 1 through 4, but we'll come back and talk a little bit more about writing. So there'll be SAQs on our midterm. And at that point, we may have, or you may have, depending on your section, a SAQ that might be about a topic from Unit 5. Okay. Questions that we might have. I'm going to stop my share for a second. Anything that comes to mind before we kind of close out. We're at about an hour, so I don't want to take your time too much longer.
Mr. Bone.
Yes, Chinmay, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Can you explain what total war is again?
Total war really has kind of two meanings. The way that I'm utilizing it here was this idea that the army would actually come in and destroy livestock and food supplies and agricultural products, railroads, infrastructure like bridges, in such a way that essentially the civilian population could not aid the military population. So prior to the Civil War, at least in American wars, we did not really have this idea that you could essentially fight civilians. Battles took place away from civilian populations, and they were two organized armies fighting back and forth. And Grant and Sherman believed that the war would continue on until the civilian population could no longer raise food for its army. It was struggling to survive. So in this sense, total war is basically using the military and taking that fight to the civilian population. That doesn't mean that you're outright killing civilians or using your guns and firing against civilians, but you are destroying food and property in order to make them unable to support their military. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
And I had a question in our chat. Our test again for Unit 5 is just 25 multiple choice. When we take our midterm, we will have 30 multiple choice items and 2 SAQs, 2 short answer questions will be our midterm. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So if other things come up, feel free, type them in, remind, ask in class. We want to make sure that vocabulary wise, that if there's anything on that SFI list, especially if I didn't get to that term, if it's something that you're not sure about, please ask. I have a couple questions about battles. So Gettysburg is certainly seen as a turning point because it's really the only significant incursion of the Confederate Army into northern land. The rest of those battles are fought southward. But also that there are some significant battles like Antietam. As a single day of fighting, it consumed the most lives. It was fought in Maryland in September of 1862. And it was a really low point for the Union Army. And a lot of historians argue that it was such a decisive loss for the Union. It's part of the reason why Lincoln begins looking at the Emancipation Proclamation, this idea of not only attempting to free slaves in the Confederacy, but also to use African-American soldiers as a part of his military. So that is one of the reasons why it was on our list. What's the difference between crop lien and sharecropping? So sharecropping is the idea that you have a white landowner and somebody then works part of that land. And at the end of the year, so essentially the growing season, the harvest, they give a portion, a share, usually half or more of what they've grown to cover essentially what is the cost of living upon that land for an entire year. Why is it called sharecropping and not tenant farming? Well, because there's usually no actual money exchanged. Most African Americans who engaged in sharecropping, they didn't actually sell their harvest. Their harvest, they took half of it or more if they had to, and gave that over to the white landowner. We will also see that white landowners, though, especially early on, can kind of take advantage of the situation. So if I'm a formerly enslaved farmer, I may not have a plow, I might not have a cotton gin, I might not have cash to go buy seed to even start my production of cotton for a season. And so I go to the landowner and say, hey, can you buy me what I need? Can you buy me the seed? Can you let me borrow your plow? Can I rent 5 hours on your cotton gin? Again, no money is exchanged hands, but this time there is debt. So you might not have any money to give me, but I'm going to say the value of 5 hours on my cotton gin is $5. And you have to now not only give me half your crop, but you have to come up with at least $5 more worth of cotton or $5 that you pay for that. So when you have a lien, you've loaned money or goods or something to some other individual, and they have to pay you back. Legally, they owe you money. So those who owned the farms that had sharecroppers living upon them, they also loaned out other money and goods. And therefore, sharecroppers often had a lien against them. So the crop lien system was that not only am I paying a portion of my crop for my rent upon this land, but then I'm also giving more of that to cover these other loans that have been made out to me. Okay. Radical Reconstruction, why is that different from regular Reconstruction? I would talk about it this way. Reconstruction is the time period between 1865 and 1877. Presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson is 1865 to 1867, but it was not doing the things that the radical Republicans liked. So in 1867, they used their supermajority in Congress to override things that he vetoed. And they went on to basically send the military back into the South. And so between 1867 and 1877, radical Reconstruction will be the military occupation of the former Confederacy and the enforcement of things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. President Grant, he becomes president in 1869, and he will serve 2 terms. So you have Lincoln from 61 to 65, he's assassinated. His second term is basically finished by Andrew Johnson, and then Grant will have 2 terms following. So basically you have a period of time, it ends up being almost 16 years of Republican presidents. And then Rutherford B. Hayes will win in 1877. And that'll be yet another Republican victory. There will actually be mostly Republican presidents between 1861 and 1913. It'll be a very long period of time when Republicans control the executive branch. It's been sort of a 50-50 flip in most of the 20th century. Okay. Other things, I'm looking at my chat. I want to make sure that I get everything. Yeah, so Parker said in terms of how did we do the points, you have, yes, that magic question that you answer. It says you didn't cheat. And then we will have, 24 multiple choice to follow. So it's not a lot of questions. And you will see there is going to be some of that repetition where you'll have the same passage, but it'll be used maybe in a compare and contrast question, and then also a cause and effect question. So very similar to what you've done before. Okay. Anything else? I will tell you this, for everybody's test, I've made the magic question the first question because I'm tired of going back and adding in 20 points or having people have crocodile tears because they're like, I have a 58. I thought I did well. And usually it's they didn't do that 20-point magic question. So I made sure to make it first this time. Okay. All right. So anything else, please ask and remind, let us know. For my folks who weren't here to join us and maybe are going to come and text you and say, hey, what'd you talk about? Let them know that we're getting off at about 7:45, and it's going to take Mrs. Sorbonne about 30 minutes, but she said by about 8:30. This will be on YouTube for all of our friends who want to check it out later. All right. Well, thank you guys. And we'll see you either Friday or Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.